Welcome to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the special operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is produced in partnership with Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm focused on helping you optimize the people side of your business. We're sponsored by Jersey Mike's Subs. Together, we share the mission of giving, making a difference in someone's life. Visit the Jedburgh Podcast, Talent War Group, and Jersey Mike's Subs on the web and on all social media. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families.
Threat landscape is going up at an almost logarithmic rate and will continue to grow at that rate. The average bank in this country is just not prepared for that. For me, the X factor were things like quantum computers. It was more artificial intelligence. It was more de novos. It was Web3. It was all these new technologies that people are investing in right now that in 5 years will be core. And as an agency, you can't wait for somebody to tell you about it 5 years from now.
We hear the word tech or technology every day. Tech seems to drive so many aspects of our lives these days. It's like we can't do anything anymore without some sort of device in our hand, at our fingertips, and soon even on our faces. But what does the tech industry actually do? What kinds of tech are there? What do all those people even mean when they say, I work in tech? Like I know what they're talking about. For my last episode of our late fall trip to DC, I visited Sultan Meghji. Sultan is the former Chief Innovation Officer at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. He's a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a fellow at the George Mason National Security Institute, a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, and now a professor in the graduate programs at Duke University's Pratt Engineering School teaching AI, Web3, and cybersecurity, some of the foundations of today's leading tech. I asked Sultan to define tech and why Google says there's 77 different kinds of technologies. We spent a good bit of time discussing FinTech and how it's changed the banking and finance industry, not just for the big banks and the regulatory agencies, but regular people like you and me. Sultan shares how his 4 innovation themes of inclusion, resilience, amplification, and future are critical to implementing sustainable technology solutions in any business of any size. We spend our lives thinking about how technology will help us and make our day easier, but Sultan and I also dig into the dark side of tech. We're in a great power struggle and a peer-to-peer battle with our adversaries like China and Russia. Much of the tech we use every day is just as easily turned against us, used as weapons, and often clandestinely concealed until it's time to strike. So we have to ask ourselves, are we really taking the powers of tech as seriously as we should for the good things they do and the bad? Check out my conversation with Sultan from his kitchen table on your favorite podcast platform. Watch the full video version on YouTube. Learn more about Sultan on LinkedIn and Twitter at Sultan Meghji. Subscribe and follow at Jedburgh Podcast on all social media. And check out our website, jedburghpodcast.com. Sultan, welcome to the Jedburgh Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks for having me to your house.
Yeah. No, this is the first time I've hosted a podcast at my dining room table.
Well, you know what happens when you admit it's your first time for anything. You owe a case of beer.
Done.
That's it. Now you do it. You admitted it. But I wanted to talk about tech, and that was how you and I were introduced. And there's so much talk in society around this word tech. We hear tech startup, tech business, fintech, biotech, smart tech. I Googled in preparation for this the word tech. And all these things come up, and mostly it's short for technology. But then I said, okay, let me expand this and put types of tech. And then I found, well, there are definitions for the 4 types of tech, 6, 7, 20, 30, 77 types of tech was the most that I saw. So I wasn't going to then be able to make a list and say, let's talk about the 4 types, because there's infinite, it appears. You built a career in tech. You were the Chief Innovation Officer at FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. You are a noted expert in AI, biotech, cybersecurity, quantum computing, Web3, scholar at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a fellow at the George Mason National Security Institute, a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, which I want to ask you about for sure, a professor in the graduate program at Duke University Pratt Engineering School. You focus on AI, Web3, and cybersecurity there. 30-year career launching, scaling, and selling a number of startups, and you work with early-stage VCs and funds that invest in technology-driven businesses. So I thought since I was unable to find a proper definition of tech, I got to start there with you. I'm going to give you what I found for technology and then let you define what tech actually means. And what I found is technology is the application of scientific knowledge to the practical aims of human life, or as it is sometimes phrased, to the change and manipulation of the human environment. I kind of liked that one. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to you?
I like both of those, and they're far better than anything I could tell you. So I'll tell you what I think, which is not as good as either of those definitions. We use tech and technology as a placeholder relative to how the caveman first had tools. It is just an extension of that. So, we were living in caves, we picked up a rock and we banged it against the wall, and all of a sudden we could make fire. And then we could move out of the caves, right? Mm-hmm. Our smartphone is just a couple 100,000 years later evolution of that. And all of this technology is just that. I fundamentally believe that humans plus technology are a different species than humans without technology. And that's why we're different than the Neanderthals.
And that ties into the manipulation of the human environment.
100%.
It's an enabler.
It doesn't say if it's good or bad. It's a change, right? We have changed it. We now have roads. We have electricity. We have running water. We have the technology we're using to record this podcast, right? These are all things that just change the environment around us, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, but they're changing it. In most cases, it's designed to make it easier or less friction or able to do things faster than we could do previously. We talk about horsepower in cars, but we really rarely remember that that's because we used to ride horses. Right. Or, you and I'm staring at your laptop right now, and I can see if I'm not close enough to the microphone, which tells me I need to lean in. And so I'm changing the environment so that the listeners can actually hear what I'm saying. Right.
That is the beauty of some of these tools that we're using here, because it takes me having to think about it away. Yeah. But in so many ways over the last 30 years, 20, 30 years, we have seen really what has become the new industrial revolution. I mean, you mentioned we went from horses to cars. Right. Now our cars, which were combustion engines, are now pieces of electronic machinery that can run on batteries and alternative fuels. What does that new industrial revolution, the technology revolution, if you will, how has that advanced society in so many ways faster than the mechanical industrial revolution?
I mean, this is such a great question to ask right now, because as we move into this environment over the last 30 years, what we've done is we've started removing people from the processes of our civilization, right? When I swipe my credit card or use Apple Pay at the store, I no longer have to have 157 people sitting behind that to make sure that transaction goes through. In fact, the vast majority of the time, there's no human involved in that process. Right. And that's the kind of really interesting thing about where we are right now is the end result of the current investments in technology we're making. And I'm talking about the stuff we're investing in right now in the fall of 2022 is going to remove people from needing to do stupid, repetitive jobs that they have done for a while. In the 1970s and 80s, we started seeing it with like car manufacturing plants where you would have robots weld and stuff like that. Now we're getting to a point with financial services and healthcare where humans aren't part of the main line of those processes. You'll have a person at one end who triggers something and a person at the other end who receives the output of that. But it becomes an automated system. And a lot of the time when I talk about artificial intelligence, I really say we should be talking about automation, because that's really what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And financial services and healthcare are particularly the two markets where we're putting tremendous money in right now to just remove people from the process. And there are a lot of reasons why, which we can talk about, but that's really what that tech is doing right now.
Well, we're going to talk about the financial industry for sure, because as many people who listen to the podcast know, when I got out of the Army and I went to business school, I worked at Merrill Lynch. And I say I lasted. I had the opportunity to be there for 18 months, and I learned a tremendous amount about finance. When you combine that with taking a finance-heavy MBA, it was a great experience coming out of special operations when you're sitting in interviews and people are saying, okay, tell us about leadership. And you're giving them these wild stories of being all over Africa and leading, multinational forces. And then they look at you and they say, well, what about the balance sheet? And you're like, what is a balance sheet? Like, great, you didn't get hired today. So it was so important to understand that world.
Well, I feel like the previous CEO of FTX probably shouldn't have been hired either, because he probably couldn't have answered that question either.
You're the third person who brought up FTX to me today.
Well, so you're in Washington, D.C. It's right before Thanksgiving, right? That's when we're recording this. It is the top story in everyone's mind here in D.C. because that whole crowd spent probably hundreds of millions of dollars in political contributions. They're running all over DC, and everyone is running around trying to make sure they're not going to get in trouble about it. And so it is the topic of topics right now. So
we got to track him down after this. But let's talk about FDIC. I mentioned you were the chief innovation officer there. Yeah. First of all, what is a chief innovation officer?
I thought you were going to ask what the FDIC was.
Well, that's the next one, because I am going to ask you about why is the FDIC so important to our banking system? Because you see it on every single bank, every single teller, every ATM, everywhere you go. It has a sticker.
Well, can I answer the questions backwards? Because why the FDIC is important leads to why it was the first federal agency that was a prudential regulator to have a chief innovation officer. So the FDIC was created a little over 80 years ago after the banking crises and all of the issues that surrounded the Great Depression. Right? They were worried about banks failing, Americans losing their savings, all of this kind of stuff. And so the FDIC was created as a private insurance company that was part of the U.S. government, that had the balance sheet of the entire country. So the entire wealth of our nation is the insurance policy protector, if you will, for the banking system. And over those 80 years, they created a series of processes so that if you wanted to become a bank and stay a bank, you would have to get a charter, which is something that you would have to get both at the state level and the federal level that would allow you to operate. And then you would have to conform to certain processes to then be allowed to operate as a bank. And if you did that, every single depository account would be insured up to some certain amount of money. It started off a much smaller amount, then it went to 150,000, 250,000. I think that's where it is today, is 250,000. There are slightly more than 4,000 banks in the United States. Now, about 80% of them are regulated by the FDIC directly, and as kind of the state level, the kind of the standard banks that we all saw growing up as kids. I'm from a cornfield in Illinois, so those kind of banks, not like the J.P. Morgans of the world, right? And what's been very interesting, especially since 2008, is that we've realized that the vast majority of new financial services products and services that have entered into the market have been brought in by either tech companies or by fintechs, not by banks. And so the banking system is kind of on its back foot. We've put trillions of dollars of new American US dollars into the system over the last 15 years. And a huge percentage of that money has never gone into the traditional banking system. And so I'll use the Starbucks app as an example. So pretty much everybody has the Starbucks app in the United States at this point. The average person who has the Starbucks app has slightly more than $30 in it. That's kind of what it is.
Well, it's like 2 coffees.
Well, at this point, it might not even be 2 coffees. It might be like a coffee and a straw. But what's interesting about that is Starbucks isn't a bank. That money isn't sitting in a bank account. So Starbucks would be a multi-$100 billion bank if you just thought about the app as a bank, right? And there are hundreds of other examples of that, from the PayPals of the world to the Starbucks of the world to Facebook to whatever, right? And so the then chair of the FDIC a few years ago realized 3 things were wrong. One is the average American was highly exposed to non-banks holding American capital. Number 2, that the pace of change in the banking system is not even remotely close to what was happening in the traditional markets. And third, the cybersecurity risks in the system were getting worse and worse and worse. What in the military or IC, we would talk about threat landscape. Threat landscape is going up at an almost logarithmic rate, and will continue to grow at that rate. The average bank in this country is just not prepared for that. And we see it every single day, whether it's ransomware or old computer systems or, the CEO, a 75-year-old CEO of a bank in the Midwest not having his home Wi-Fi have an encrypted password on it. Therefore, bad guys can drive by his house and pretend to be him and send a wire and all this stuff. And this happens on a daily basis. And so we created the role of Chief Innovation Officer, reporting to the chairman of the FDIC, to specifically address these exact issues. One was around human capital, one was around competitiveness, one was around the cyber risk to the system, and the last was really around educating the entire system and the other regulators about why this was important, to the point that now every single federal regulatory body has a chief innovation officer and a whole team. That you see it in the White House, you see it in the OCC, the Federal Reserve, CFPB, SEC, all of these. And this was the first time we created it as a departmental function, as a deputy, someone who could really drive some real change in the system.
Had a seat at the table.
Yeah. Yeah, to the point where there were entire sections of the portfolio of the chairman that I just owned.
Right. So you mentioned fintech. I mentioned it earlier. I think that the word fintech is, I don't know if I'd say overused, but I'd say it's used by many, probably mostly in a context to make it seem like you know what you're talking about more than anything else.
Yeah, it's a marketing phrase. I mean, a lot of these tech words that you've said, since the beginning when we started recording are just marketing phrases.
That's why I threw them out.
Yeah. I mean, like cloud computing. Like cloud computing has been around since 2008, and that's just a marketing phrase, right? When they talk about an on-premise cloud, that just means it's a data center, and we've been doing that for 60 years, right? So, but fintech, at its broadest categorical definition, just means the application of technology to finance. And we've been doing that for 70 years, right? Yeah. There are people who talk about 15-year-old fintechs. I'm like, well, that's a meaningless phrase. It just means the application of technology. The vast majority of financial services firms in the United States don't use technology newer than 15 years ago.
Why is that? And this is where I wanted to go with this, because you had mentioned, and you had said in a couple of the talks that you've given, that the banking in general is behind the power curve. You said it a few minutes ago too, that they're behind the innovation and the technology curve. Why is it as an industry that that's the case? And I mean, I saw this firsthand when I worked at Merrill Lynch. You see very user-friendly type things on your iPhone. And on the Mac, and then you go into a bank and it's clunky, it's square, it's hard to use.
It's the green text on the black screen that's curved, from the mid 80s. You still have that, right? That's very common in the banks. Yeah. So if you talk to people in the banking system, what they will tell you is it's because the regulation is so onerous, right? That's what they always say, and that's why they can't do it. And the technology is too expensive, and they give you all these reasons why they can't do it.
But this drives world economies.
It does. And so the reality is, the vast majority of financial services institutions in the United States, and I'm just going to talk about the United States. I'm talking about chartered banks, chartered credit unions. There are little under 10,000 of them in the country of this very specific category of deposit-taking institutions that are regulated by the U.S. government.
So everybody who's getting ready to become a special operator, go to selection for whether it's going to be a Green Beret, Navy SEAL, you want to become an Army Ranger, you want to join the Air Force, become a pararescueman, right? They can come to you, hop on 18 Alpha Fitness app, and you're going to take them through some very specific workouts that are designed for each one of those training programs.
I always start off everybody day one of 18 Alpha Fitness is my push-up from hell. Spider-Man push-ups. So on a down position, your left knee comes to your left elbow. Right knee comes to your right elbow. Yeah. Next one is diamonds, everybody's favorite. And make sure you get that chest off that ground. All right, wide arm. Be on your knee. This is the knee one, but you're gonna go down and explode up.
You want to take it to the next level. You want to be one of America's best. Get on 18 Alpha Fitness. Check it out.
Ten years ago, the average CEO was 60, the average chair of the board was 65. 2 years ago, the average CEO was 70 and the average chairman was 75. And another 5 years,
person.
it's the exact same person. 85% of the time, it's the same person, right? And these guys have been sitting in these jobs like so many baby boomers are and just treading water. And they are so risk averse, and they don't know how to run very efficient businesses. And so they don't have the money. So it's a risky thing in their mind because they don't understand it. Most of these guys don't know how to change the ringtone on their iPhones, right? And then that you turn around and you say, well, a normal business spends, roughly speaking, 7% of their annual operating expense on technology, just maintenance, just like mainline, keeping the lights on. It is hard to find a bank in the United States that spends more than 4%. And so they basically underinvest by about 100. If they doubled what they were investing right now, so they're down by about 50%, then they'd be on par with their competitors. And the leadership teams don't know about it. The board of directors of these institutions, they don't have somebody, for example, who is supposed to be in charge of cybersecurity, which pretty much any reasonably governed organization should. And so not only do those institutions don't have the right people in place, they don't have the right money in place, therefore they can't put the right technology in place, right? And you see a direct parallel of that in the regulatory system. The president just renominated somebody who had already been chair, and he's been acting chair of the FDIC. I think he's 80, right? You have these people who fundamentally don't understand these technologies in these jobs. And so they don't understand the risk factor. They don't understand that threat landscape, not just on the cyber side, but just the risk of the system, right? And then all of a sudden you have the banking equivalent of the Flint water crisis that could happen, because what if, here's an example. There are 3 tech companies that nobody's ever heard of that control over 80% of the technology in the banking system, okay? They are not regulated like a bank is. They just kind of go off and do their thing. Their average systems are more than 15 years old. They struggle to do cloud computing. Well, we've been doing cloud computing since 2008, basically. Right. You have an entire categorical set of companies, institutions, and people that just are not wired for this kind of new technology. And that's why you walk in and you see a mainframe, or you see a beige computer from the mid 1990s sitting underneath the CFO's desk. And if you unplug it, the entire bank crashes.
And those are situations too, where you see that and you can't even, I remember not even be able to remote in. So you couldn't work from home. Now I think things have probably certainly changed over the last couple of years with COVID. But.
Yeah, during COVID, a lot of really great mid 2000s VPNs got turned on, which have made it very easy for a very small subset of people to work from home. But then you turn around and it's opened up more cybersecurity risk.
So it's interesting because tech is young, finance is old. And now you have to sit here and figure out, how do we bring these two together?
It's a real challenge, and just like so many other challenges we have in the market right now, it's fundamentally an education problem, right? There's an entire category of leadership that just are uneducated about these topics and are old enough that they don't feel like they need to be educated about these topics. And I think there's a generational change moment happening. And when we get through it, then I think this becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, you said that you have to look around your leaders and they need to be 40. 41's okay.
Yeah. So the median age of a federal regulator is almost 60. The median age of a bank employee is over 50. It should be under 40. And because the median age in the workforce right now is 37. Okay? Banks shouldn't be decades or more off of that. It should be right in that same range. And so people are like, oh, well, they need experience. But I hear a lot of excuses. I don't hear a lot of like, well, why am I not bringing on younger people to do these things? Because they're just not part of the club. And there's a lot of, it's I don't want to say it's discriminatory, but it certainly leans more in that direction. You don't see a lot of banks where the head of technology reports to the president and is under the age of 40.
I want to put this whole thing into context, because you also worked for a bit with the New York Stock Exchange on their technology innovation. And one of the largest advancements in financial services was the change from traders running on the floor with tickets and throwing them across the room at each other to an automated system where we still have traders on the floor, but
they're really just kind of manning booths.
It's one of the things I'm most proud of, and I don't get to tell this story, so I'm going to tell what I think is one of the coolest projects I've ever worked on.
I think it's one of the coolest projects that's happened in society.
It was so cool what we did. So this was late 90s, early 2000s, pre 9/11. Back, if anybody who's listening remembers Palm Pilots and like the first generation of PDAs, where they weren't connected. You had to plug them into a dock next to your computer every day to sync your calendar.
We didn't have Bluetooth,
right? No, there was no wireless, right? It was like you'd plug it into like a printer port or a serial port, right? No USB even, right? We took a first generation Palm Pilot and a first generation, it's called a Compact iPack. It was like the competitor from the old company Compaq. And we put a backpack on it that could speak to a cellular network for data. And then we wrote an app that would allow you to buy or sell a stock using this really thick device. It was probably like 3 inches thick. You basically take your biggest iPhone and put like 4 of them stacked against each other. And that's about the size of what this thing is. The battery would last about 3 hours. And we just thought it was the coolest thing because we got it running on this test system. And we took it out to lunch. And this was like one of these trader, lunch places where it's like lots of martinis, cigars, people are still smoking and stuff. And so we'd stand at the bar as a test case just to see if we could create what we would now call FOMO, with all these guys with their brightly colored jackets and stuff, coming off the floor. And I would sit there and these guys are talking about something. They're like, oh yeah, we're going to do this after thing and everything. We hope it doesn't go above this price. And I'm just like, and I'm doing this on the thing. And this guy's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm executing what you just said. And he's like, are you blanking kidding me? I'm like, no, we're just doing it. And we took the average transactional price on NYSE was about $40 before we did this. After we did it, we drove it down to like 7. And then it directly got to a point where it became almost a zero cost transaction. But the very first time we could do that, not on the floor or attached to one of these fancy terminals, was with these little Compact iPacks and Palm Pilot.
And what's making up with that cost is the volume and the personnel.
Yeah. It's a lot of just, you got to pay for the trader. You've got to pay for his office. You got to pay for his access. A market maker seat back in the day was a fortune to buy one, if you could even get one. Now, doesn't matter. It doesn't exist as a thing.
Well, they're sitting in their living room on their couch doing it.
Well, it's back in the day, it's like getting a taxi shield, right? Like that was a big investment. You had to know a guy who knew a guy. It had like all these like kind of mafia overtones to it, and that's exactly what getting a market maker seat was like up through the late 90s.
And that whole project then set off the move from Lower Manhattan to what most people don't understand is the physical presence of the facility is in the financial district in Lower Manhattan. But the NYSE is a data center in New Jersey, of which now many of the banks moved their own headquarters closer to that data center, because there was this whole concept that if we're closer, then there might be a millionth of a second difference in our transaction versus somebody else. Yeah,
so nanosecond, what we're getting to and out of that is the ability to do frictionless near real-time transactions. And so I'm going to slightly correct you. The NYSE is not a data center in New Jersey. There are actually 7 of them scattered across the country, 3 of which I believe are still secret. Like I don't think I'm supposed to talk about them, because I think one of them is co-located inside a DoD facility still. But the network became the thing. It wasn't the people. Yeah. It wasn't even the servers. It became your ability to touch the network. And so all that matters is that you're connected to the backbone. And that then allowed this next generation of hedge funds to start really driving alpha on this and doing amazing stuff. And you saw Bridgewater's probably one of the most famous companies that did that. Is they would buy a rack, one rack over from the main rack that NYSE used, and they could just shove stuff in it as quickly as humanly possible, and they could front run everybody else's transactions. And it became, lots of other stuff happened, but that's why the flash crash occurred. That's why we had to put new controls in around that. It's how Robinhood got to zero cost trades, because they were really the first, and it got to a point where the average American now has full access to the entire public markets of the United States with very little effort. That wasn't true 30 years ago. And it demonstrated not just that you could execute, but that you could clear, you could do all the regulatory processes, you could buy, sell during the day, you could participate in IPO, you could do all of that. We put all of those systems in place so that it wasn't just being able to buy and sell. There's a lot of other stuff that you had to do there. But on the back end of that, we then demonstrated to every other aspect of financial services and healthcare, by the way, that this is possible. Because if you can do it in real time at the New York Stock Exchange, you've solved every tech problem out there.
Right.
There are no other tech problems to solve. You've solved cybersecurity, you've solved the network, you've solved the app, you've solved all these other things. And we're still feeling the ripples of that. And the banking system, back to why a chief innovation officer at FDIC, the banking system is the next logical place for that to go. Because at the end of the day, a depository account at a bank should be as frictionless and easy to manage as a equity account working against the New York Stock Exchange. Fact is, it's not. And we're 25 years out from some of this work. At some point, the banking system is going to have to adapt to that, or they're just going to get run out of the system entirely.
One of the challenges that you had at FDIC was fighting this institutionalized thought. We talked about the generational gap, but now once you're in these roles, and we let's say in any organization, and you see it across many different industries now, you have this inclusion of the median age of the 37-year-old workforce going into organizations, but now you have this generational divide that exists. You created 4 innovation themes that you instituted into FDIC that I would say are actually very applicable to any organization who seeks technological change and advancement: inclusion, resilience, amplification, and future. Can we break these down for a minute?
Let's go. Yeah.
Let's start with inclusion. Why? What's it mean?
For me, it's very simple. The American dream is the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Like, that's the American dream, right? We all should be having the same opportunity to go into a system and be as successful as anybody else, right? The banking system is particularly bad at that. If you look at the demographics in the banking system, they are not reflective of our nation at all. It is fundamentally one specific gender, it's one specific age, it's one specific race, it's one specific socioeconomic background. I use this as a placeholder. The average bank president didn't buy his first house. Mm-hmm. His parents bought him his first house, right? And everything downstream of that. He didn't, he's had a country club membership since he was 17 because his dad bought it for him for graduating high school. He didn't buy his first car. There's all these things that are true of that crowd. And the fact is that's not what America looks like today. And so not only do we have to have a banking system that has inclusion built into it for the average American, but it actually needs to be run by people that look more like every other American, right? Just like in the military. Military, especially in the enlisted ranks, looks way more like every other American than the admiralty or the general's ranks generally do historically, right? Now we're seeing a lot of change there, but it's been a lot of work too.
Well, that's one of the great things about the military is it's a microcosm of the demographic spectrum that we have in America.
But you look at especially the Army post Vietnam War, it's done a fantastic job of becoming much more representative than it was through that era, right? And the banking system to me is quite similar to that. And so whether it's making sure it's the right products and services for the people that need it today, especially like people doing like gig economy or, having a side hustle, they have their own LLC, we have to make sure that we have banking products and services that are fit for purpose for that. But then the people running those institutions need to be reflective of that population. And then the people regulating and governing the banking system itself should be more reflective of it. I was basically one of the first people in the regulatory system to have a funny name and be brown, in that senior of a role, right? Within the ethnic religious group that my father comes from, I am the most senior person to ever serve in the U.S. government in that community, from that community, which blows my mind, right? Because it's a 50 million population group of people.
What about resilience?
Resilience is really simple. The world is changing. The threat landscape is changing. Whether or not you have an opinion on climate or what that means to us, the fact is some guy down the street can take a backhoe through a fiber optic cable and take you offline. Okay? You don't just need to think about that. You need to plan for it, and you need to practice it, and you make sure that when it does happen, it doesn't actually impact what you're doing. And so you have to practice, prepare, execute the plans on a daily basis for anything that can take you offline. If you're a bank, that means making sure you have 2 internet routes through 2 different providers, 2 different, pipes through the ground, all that kind of great stuff. If you're, at home, make sure you've got batteries for your phones and maybe a generator or, solar panels or whatever, right? We have to accept that so much of the infrastructure in our country has not been invested in decades. And we still have to live our lives. We still have to operate the way we do. And so resilience is not just thinking about getting punched, knowing you're going to get punched, and practice taking that punch because it's going to happen.
Well, we talk about how you prepare today determines success tomorrow. That's the tagline of the podcast. And that's all about resilience. In context for us, a lot about resilient leadership, and understanding and planning and thinking about your emotions and the different situations you're going to encounter, and then being able to get back.
Well, I mean, and this is something that I found, just on a bit of a tangent, a little bit disappointing, when I was inside the government, is, I've been through a lot of crises in my life, whether it was 9/11 or the SARS epidemic, or, a variety of other things have happened to me, getting injured and all this stuff. And a lot of people in the military have gone through this as well. The first time you're in a firefight, pure adrenaline, you taste all the stuff in your mouth, you're running around, you don't remember anything.
Terror?
Yeah, right. You probably, you throw up 15 minutes later, the whole thing, right? Second time, 10% easier, maybe 20% easier. Yeah. And then, by the 15th time, assuming you're still there, it's like, oh, okay, so that thing blew up right next to me, right? We don't have resilient leadership in a lot of places. I think a lot of Americans expect us to, because they haven't been through these kinds of crises. They haven't seen this kind of stuff. They haven't experienced it firsthand. I was in a country in South America. There was a huge earthquake, like so much it knocked me out of my bed.
Wow.
At 4 a.m. or something like that. I had exactly 90 minutes to get to the airport and get out of the country. I would have been stuck there for 6 weeks. Or I would have had to have taken some crazy road over the mountains in the back of a Toyota pickup truck to get out and stuff. You have moments like that occur to you, and you realize what you have to then become, not just to be a resilient leader, but also to be a resilient leader that can show that to everybody else who hasn't gone through that. And I think COVID has really explored for a lot of us that there just aren't that many resilient leaders, and we need to grow them as fast as humanly possible.
Well, we talked a lot about this morning, actually. I was telling you I had the opportunity to go to the Capitol and sit down with Congressman Mike Waltz, and he's a Green Beret, still serving in the National Guard. And we talked about the fact that veterans now going into the 188th Congress starting in January will make up about 90 to 91 seats will be veterans, and 30 of alone from the Army in the House. And one of the most exciting parts of that is that's the greatest influx of veterans that have been into Congress since post-Vietnam era. And one of the things that they're looking for is exactly what you're saying, putting people into these positions who have a broader understanding of experiences in the world, to have faced levels of adversity, had to be resilient. And so when we are having disagreement across party lines, we can be what the former Congressman and Secretary of the Army, Patrick Murphy, told me, we can disagree, but not be disagreeable. Because we're unified by a mission.
Well, just having more mission-oriented individuals, I think, is going to be a step in the right direction, because I think a lot of people, especially here in D.C., as somebody who's not from D.C., we're sitting in D.C. right now, and there are a lot of great things to love about D.C. It's nation's capital, all this great stuff. There are a lot of people here who think they are better because they're here. They think they're fancier because they're here. And it kind of drives me crazy. They don't understand that there's a mission. If you're sent here by your constituency, there's a reason you're sent here, and there's a mission. And there are a lot of people who don't act like that.
The next one's amplification.
Yeah. I don't think we communicate very well. And so to me, that's what amplification is.
Fact.
It is, we do a lot of amazing stuff in our nation, in the banking system, in the regulatory community, is what I was talking about. And we need to communicate it better. So, great example. When I went in, one of the very first questions I asked is, what AI are we using at FDIC to manage the risk in the banking system? Because that is the best that's one of the best applications. It's an absolutely fantastic use case for AI. And I was told by everyone, we don't use AI at all. We don't trust it. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm rather surprised to hear that. And about 3 months in, after a little bit of me being proven in the organization, a guy 4 layers below, one of the people I talked to, emailed me and said, oh, yeah, we use AI for this, that, and the other. And I'm like, I literally was talking to your boss's boss's boss, and she said you didn't use it. Like, oh, yeah, we didn't tell her. I'm like, really? Why? And he's like, well, she doesn't understand it, all this. And And I'm like, okay, well, that's a little weird. And so then I'm like, okay, great. Well, I'm like, do you mind if I talk about this? He's like, no, you get it. Go for it. Like, this is an important part of what we do as an organization. I'm like, okay, well. And so I made a presentation to the chairman, and she got super excited, everybody, like the whole leadership team. And then the person who this person reported into was like, well, we should stop using that because that's unproven technology, And I said to this, I'll save the name because I don't want to embarrass anyone. I'm like, this has been in place for 4 years. And she's like, no, I didn't know that.
Within the organization.
Within the organization, the exact same thing. Yeah. I'm just like, okay, well, this is a great example of kind of that gap. And so for amplification, it wasn't just making sure that we as an agency were telling the American people what we were doing to protect them, but also to amplify, the 6,000 staff at the agency so they knew that we were listening and we cared about what we were doing. And if they were doing great stuff, we wanted to amplify that up and then out. Like the minute I started talking about the fact we were using AI at the agency for stuff, every other agency's somebody senior called me. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. Can we use it? Right. And that's exactly what you want. You want your government being good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, being on mission, and making use of things that are proven across as many agencies as possible. You don't want the boondoggles of paying for things 30 times and all of that.
The last one's future.
Yeah, this is the X factor. Anybody who says they can predict the future has no idea what they're doing. I mean, come on, we know this,
There's
right?
people who've made their jobs, their job titles like futurist.
Yeah. I got introduced as a futurist once at a conference, and I got so embarrassed. I was just like, I don't know if I should even be here. But for me, it's really simple. Either you're building for the future, you're building for 5 to 10 years out, or you're lost, right? So in a military context, you don't plan to fight the last war, you plan to fight the next war, right? And people spend all this energy with the intel community trying to figure out what the bad guys are thinking, what those next conflicts are going to look like, the kinds of tools that will be used, et cetera, right? In the banking system in particular, they are great at navel gazing and great at looking 5 to 10 years in the past. And most people still talk about the financial crisis and mean 2008. It's like, well, we've had like 2 more since then. So like, can we get with the program a little bit? And so for me, the X factor were things like quantum computers. It was more artificial intelligence. It was more de novos. It was Web3. It was all these new technologies that people are investing in right now that in 5 years will be core. And as an agency, you can't wait for somebody to tell you about it 5 years from now, and then you tell them to stop for 2 years, which they have been known to do. I mean, especially the current chairman has told people to just stop until they can spend 2 years figuring it out. And when your median age is 57 and you don't have any younger people who understand technology and leadership, you're in a position where the regulatory agency won't understand it, and they'll just say no, right. Which then leads to one of my biggest concerns, which is competitiveness, right? I want the United States to continue to be the backbone of the global financial system. I think it gives us tremendous soft power. I think it kind of kicks some of the bad guys in the teeth, kicks our enemies in the teeth, keeps us in a position where we can dictate terms of what the future looks like. If we give up on being the home of financial innovation globally, then the Chinese and others will just use that to win the next set of battles. And the simple way for me to look at it is global reserve currency. Right now, it's about 57% is the US dollar, according to IMF. In the 80s, it was as high as 83%, I believe, 83, 84, something like that. Don't quote me on that number, but it was in the 80s range, right? So it went from 80 to 57 over the last 35, 40 years. What are we doing to get it back up to 80%? What are we doing to continue to be that, not only the currency that everybody uses, but the wires in the ground that everybody uses? Because after World War II, it was a great power for us to be the guys who created the global telecommunications infrastructure,
right? And
then to create the internet. What are we doing so that by the end of this century, we're still in this leadership position? Because I don't see anything happening.
I want to keep going on the future piece, and I know we made fun of the futurists, but when we talk about tech innovation and the need for organizations to focus on certain areas, you've also you've mentioned a few of the themes here, but you've concretely said we have to focus on human capital, cybersecurity, and competition. You mentioned China
have spoken at length on a number of our episodes, and and again, even this morning with Congressman Waltz, about this peer-to-peer battle that we're in, and you've mentioned it as well in many of your talks. We have said for 20 years of the global war on terror, we fought an enemy that was by and large inferior to our capabilities. They did a phenomenal job in many ways of competing with us in unconventional ways, but they were not what we would consider a peer nation. And the term we used during the global war on terror for China, Russia, North Korea was this term near peer. I've actually stopped using that term because that fight is here. We're in the peer fight. And anyone who thinks that we're not needs to probably watch the news at least one day and then get with the program, because we are in the peer-to-peer fight front and center.
And it's not just military hardware. It's not just financial infrastructure, although both of those are big ones. They are trying to hit on every single thing we do well as a nation. Education, entertainment, you go down the list. I mean, there's some talking points that I feel like a lot of people don't know. I mean, just looking at naval construction by the PRC, right? They're going to end up having a bigger fleet than ours in like less than 5 years.
Oh, and they own the ports.
And they own all
Look
of
at
them.
Djibouti. I mean,
Exactly.
we have, and I lived at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti for 6 months while China invested billions of dollars in the construct of the port that was 5 miles or whatever it is down the road from our largest base in Africa. And in order for our naval ships to come into the only deep water port in the Horn of Africa, you got to pay the Chinese.
If you go down the east coast of Africa, all the way from Yemen, all the way down to South Africa, you will find.
I've been on most of it.
I was in Dar es Salaam. Great example. Single largest petroleum entry point into East Africa. Entirely built, managed, and run by the Chinese. There's a single road that comes out of it. That road bisects the airport from the city of Dar es Salaam. So guess what? When the Chinese fuel trucks come through, that road is cut off. Right? Chinese don't need to do it because they fly in through the port side. They can just fly in, and those fuel trucks shoot up. They go north and west, and they just keep going down the roads that they built themselves. Right? I mean,
you're looking at that in Cameroon. There's another place. They went into Cameroon. They won, or quote unquote won the contract to build the infrastructure, build the airport. The Cameroonians were under the impression that they were going to hire the Cameroon people, and then they flew 747 plane loads of Chinese workers in there, built all the infrastructure, and left the people.
Exactly. And then you go 1 or 2 miles out of that infrastructure, and guess what? Every bodega is selling Chinese phones on Chinese cell networks with Chinese apps on it. They're just walking down this line. So we see a huge investment on the naval side that they're doing incredibly strong work with. They're going to have force projection through carriers and cruise and hypersonics and all this other stuff they're doing. They already have highly encrypted networks because they're using quantum encrypted network technology already. They were the first to deploy it. They were actually the first to deploy it in space too, right? You have an incredible offensive and defensive cyber operation, right? They have tremendous capital, because every time, Citibank pays some of the debt that it owes the Chinese, that cash doesn't go back to the PRC. They use it to buy something, right? The CHIPS Act was a great first step. We need about 30 more of them, right? To stop them being able to do some of this, more tech-oriented development. But the fact is, they've got subs, they've got carriers, they've got, they totally penetrated the Joint Strike Fighter program and have their own version of that now, right? Including the holographic displays and all the other really cool stuff, right? We're in this situation where I think we should think that we are on our back foot a little bit. I don't want to say war footing, but I go past your comment about near peer to peer. I think we're probably one step past that. That's how I would do it. And I would, I love the fact that we're watching the Russian military basically slam itself against a wall, and just use up all their material and use up all their guys and on all this and cause all this strife. But the fact is, that's a distraction, right? That is not the war I'm worried about. I am worried about, by the time we get to 2040, 2050, all of the communications infrastructure globally will be Chinese. All the financial services infrastructure will be Chinese, and it's all going to be on the back of significant naval and other infrastructure investments that they're making now that we're not doing a whole lot to stop.
Why though?
Why
aren't we doing enough?
I mean, this is where I get a little controversial, so I'll just pre-apologize for it. I don't see a lot of really great strategic thinking, right? You come out of World War II, and this is where we can talk about Bretton Woods, because to me, we need a Bretton Woods style moment, right? Bretton Woods, the reason the U.S. is the global reserve currency is because the U.S. ambassador waited for the British ambassador after a meeting at the Bretton Woods to go to the bathroom, and then he scribbled in the notes that instead of creating a currency that everyone would use as the global reserve currency, he scratched it out and said it would be the U.S. dollar, and nobody really caught it. And then it became the U.S. dollar. Well, guess because he knew that would give us amazing strategic long-term power, right? We need to think like we just came out of World War II. We're just coming out of COVID. We're coming out whatever. But we need to think about the next 50 and 100 years and say, okay, what do we have to do strategically to win every single one of these? And not just allow the congressional infighting and a bunch of 80-year-olds running around who don't understand any of this to say, well, my planning horizon is 2 to 4 years because I'm thinking about an election or I'm thinking about retirement or whatever. And we're not actually thinking strategically about this. I struggle to find too many people within a 30-mile radius of where we're sitting, because we're sitting in Washington, D.C. right now, who I think are really amazing strategic leaders who can actually get us focused on some of these conversations. I see it far more in the private sector. I see people having these conversations. Nobody in Congress, very few people in the executive branch really want to have this conversation because they're too focused on the next election cycle or whatever. And it drives me totally crazy because you have to invest thinking 10, 15, 20, 30 years in the future. And not just invest in terms of dollars, but in attention, education, all these things. I will give you my perfect example on the human side of this. I've been a professor for a long time, mostly teach either business or engineering. I have not had a U.S. citizen out of the many hundreds of graduate students I have had at places like Duke and Washington University for the last 5 years. I've not had a single American citizen. 90% of my students have been PRC. And instead of coming over and then sticking around and then becoming U.S. citizens and joining the American dream, they all go home immediately.
That's just scary.
Yeah, there are no Americans in my current cybersecurity class this semester. None. I have all PRC and one kid from South Asia.
We had a chance, I had a chance last year to speak with retired two-star General Craig Weldon. Works for a company now called Velantra Hypersonics. And started by a Marine. And we talked a lot about the technological innovation of the Chinese and how when you look at hypersonic weaponry, the last time we as a nation invested in hypersonic weaponry was like the SR-72, the Blackbird, which is sitting in a museum at Dulles Airport. And now that is predicted to be one of the game changers when we talk about warfare moving into the next decade.
Well, hypersonics is a huge issue, and sadly, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has actually worked against what I think you and I would both agree with is the right way to think about this, because the Russians tried using hypersonics and to kind of nominal effect, right? And so everybody's like, "Oh, hypersonics aren't that big a deal." I'm like, I don't really care about some piece of junk Russian tech.
Right.
I'm worried about the Chinese thing that will take out one of these new Ford-class carriers with a single missile with a conventional warhead, right? And all they have to do is pockmark the takeoff and landing bit or hit the engines, and great, nuclear waste melt down in the middle of the ocean, and we're running around. We don't have a lot of these operational. I think it's 8 operational right now, right? Of the big carriers, hypersonics are an example of a technology where it is one of the first places actually where the Chinese have done something other than just photocopy what somebody else has done. They're actually inventing something, and they're actually doing something kind of interesting. And it works against the narrative here in DC that the Chinese can't invent anything. They absolutely can. It's easier for them to steal it from us, which is what they do on a daily basis. But, we have a lot of work to do on hypersonic defense. right? I worked on some of the Patriot upgrades, in the 90s and 2000s, and a lot of the tech that we think is going to work on that is just not going to work on that. Like, I'm gonna hurl a rock in the air and hope the hypersonic hits it. Come on, that's not how that's going to work.
Do they have smarter people?
It's not a matter of smarter people or not smarter people. It's a matter of educated and motivated, right? Education and mission, right? If you have a population that's 3 times bigger than ours, and you educate them from the 4th grade to be hard asses in STEM, and then you say the mission is the survival of our country, because the word for country and the word for China are the same, right, in Mandarin, right? A lot of people don't know that because they only think there's one country, right? It is a existential fight that they are putting their people in that focuses on mission, right? We haven't had that since World War II, really. And so we don't have that same sense of mission operating the private sector, the public sector, academia, government, all of these things working together on common mission. We don't have that. So do we currently have a more educated workforce? Yes, that's falling quickly. Do we have the same mission orientation and investment profile? Not remotely. 10 cents on the dollar at best, right? If they can maintain that, then we're gonna have some trouble in the coming decades.
And we've been unable to mobilize the populace. And I think that's one of the biggest things when we talk about World War II, and to an extent you can talk about the Cold War too, because you remember President Reagan talking about this is a battle between good and evil. Yeah. And we've seen evil over the last year, and our fight in the global war on terror was against an ideology, but we didn't mobilize as a nation to say we're 100% all together mission oriented against these ideologies that are going to destroy our way of life. I think your points on China are very valid because that's what you're seeing there. And you're seeing them say that this is for the protection and the long-term longevity of our nation and our people. We have forgotten that.
Yeah, well, I agree completely with that. It's the biggest challenge right now is that all the ways that we would traditionally go and say this is how it is an existential threat to us, they are trying to show that our economic system is not valid. They are trying to show that our political system is not valid. They're trying to show that our societal construct is invalid. We aren't doing anything to say you're wrong, to say no, here's how we're going to prove that. And in doing so, we are leaving room for autocracy. We are leaving room for oligarchy. We are leaving room for, these other systems that then weaken our entire species. And we're at a point where we are running out of time to stop that before we have to really play catch up. And I worry that if they own digital, if they own quantum, if they own financial, if they own all the things you and I've talked about today, then how do we get past that? What's the next thing that gets invented? How many decades will that take? And if it's at a point where we are a bankrupt nation that doesn't have the ability to run any of these discussions, and then what's the goal there? Like, what do we do? And we need more strategic thinkers and more coordination and more mission focus, I think, as a nation in that.
Yeah, I think it starts at the top. I think it starts with our elected leaders coming together and and saying that we've got to stop the political infighting. We have to stop the divisiveness. We have to say what unifies the nation. And we can't. One of the things too is we talk about it. Everyone gets up. Oh, we've got to work together. We've got to cross the aisle. But what are you actually doing?
Well, this is a big challenge in DC because I think a lot of people. I don't lead with my political affiliation at all because I don't think it's relevant. I'm an American citizen. 80% of what
First
I say.
and foremost.
Yeah. You and I don't know each other very well, but I can guarantee you that somewhere between 60 and 80% of what I believe, you also believe.
Yeah.
Right? You and I might not be the same party. We might be the same party, and it still might be 60, 80%, right? And the fact is the current generation of political leaders are way too focused on the 20 to 40% that gets them clicks and gets them on cable news and generates them, rage tweets and rage checks to donate to the next election campaign. And doesn't actually focus on what our nation needs. Like going into this split Congress, we're going to have budget. There's now going to be a series of conversations and fights over funding the U.S. government, right? That's going to happen, right? It's a stupid thing. Raising the debt ceiling. It's a stupid conversation to have. We have to raise the debt ceiling. Otherwise, it defaults. It kills the value of the U.S. dollar. Guess what? We're no longer global reserve currency if we default on the U.S. dollar. Done. Like, that's it. Like, that is a long-term strategic thing. It cannot happen. If it happens, you might as well hand the Chinese a bunch of that stuff. That's not how we're talking about it, because a couple politicians on one side want to make it a fight so that the other side does this and this, that, and all this like checkers that they're playing. You know, a really good friend of mine framed it to me like this. He's like, most of the time in the United States politics, we play checkers. Every once in a while, you get a guy who plays chess. And the entire time that's happening, there are a bunch of Chinese guys playing Go at the one table over.
Yeah.
Right? We are in a position where we are not meeting them head on strategically. And this some of the stuff we're seeing with our elected leaders is just going to play right into their hands.
And we talked a lot about that human capital piece and that discussion there. Cybersecurity is the second one of these, and I found some very interesting points that you've made about cybersecurity, saying that the Russian and the Chinese are already in. It's just a matter of activating it. And I'm reminded of I had an opportunity to sit down with Steve Bernard and Rich Davis. Steve Bernard was the former chief security officer of Sony Pictures when the North Koreans hacked Sony and shut them down after the James Franco movie on North Korea. And then Rich Davis was the chief security officer for a very long time, 40 years at United, 20 plus years as the chief security officer there during 9/11, which was not a technological attack, but one of the things we talked about was, the consistent cyber attack that the aviation industry is under. Yeah. And, one of the biggest fears, we've seen it represented in shows like 24 and in Die Hard, Die Hard 2, what happens, you can, if you expose those systems to a malicious actor and you could take control of the entire aviation grid. Yeah. Yeah. Where are we in cybersecurity?
Man, we have a lot of work to do. I mean, I'll start there. On the human capital side, I think the primary national cybersecurity advisor to the president, I think he has publicly said we need 100,000 more people in cybersecurity in the United States, like right now. I think that's probably underestimating. I think double that number is probably what we need.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah, it's huge because we have so many different generations of technology. We have analog, we have first generation, we have mainframes. Like we have some of these old systems like the air traffic control system. We have very, very new systems like some of the crypto systems. Kind of everything in between, right? So we have one really big human problem there. Number two is we still struggle with most people doing basic cyber triage. I always joke and say, how many people have at least one, if not two, multi-factor authenticator apps on their phone? And you can see about half the people when I say this are like, what's that?
Yeah, that's because they're annoying.
Well, yeah, but
then you don't want to use them. I mean, it's an attitude thing. We talked about mobilization of the country. It's an attitude thing. You don't want to use them, and it hurts us.
I don't know. I actually kind of like them because it just makes me feel good. I've been very public about this. I only work with 2 banks in the United States because I only think there are 2 that are actually safe. I don't say which 2 they are. But
start freaking everybody out.
Well, yeah. I would also probably get a phone call from someone at my former employer if I said that. But I both of them require multi-factor authentication. They do a bunch of very interesting stuff on the tech side. So, for example, if I am using a card associated with one of those banks and I don't have my cell phone with me, they have enough geolocation information to be like, oh, maybe his card was stolen, so they ping this. There's a bunch of kind of thoughtful behavioral activity built into it. There's some really good stuff there. So first, there's this human capital issue. We need to grow more cybersecurity professionals, and we need to do a better job of educating people, especially those who are digitally native, on cybersecurity and basic cyber triage for yourself. So that's one big area. The second is it is always going to be easier in cyber to be an offensive actor than a defensive actor, right? I can take the laptop you're using to record this, and in an hour or 2, I could go onto the dark web, I could buy some stuff, I could probably impersonate you in some meaningful way digitally, open a bank account, do something. And unless you've done a number of steps, including freezing, locking your credit and report and some other stuff like that, I could probably buy a car pretending to be you. It'd probably take me this afternoon.
My wife wants a new car, so
Okay, well, I'll show her how to do it then.
so let her know how to do that.
Yeah,
Because I'm not interested in doing it.
Yeah, and but like that's how
Scary.
easy it is. Yeah, it's terrifying, right? The challenge is that we have not been investing enough on the technology side, on the defensive side, right? So I'll give you a couple of great examples. There's one. So about 2.5 years ago, an open source piece of technology called Log4j, a big hack was discovered that would allow anyone using that in any piece of technology to be compromised incredibly easy, and they could put ransomware on the system, they could put a crypto miner, they could do all this terrible stuff. It was announced, I believe, early this morning from CISA, which is the primary cybersecurity group out of the White House, that a civilian federal agency had been compromised for at least 8 months, if not 18 months, entirely. Their network was entirely compromised with this on it, and a bunch of people were doing stuff. And kind of the only reason anybody noticed is because somebody actually logged into a server that was acting funny and noticed a crypto miner, basically, is what happened. I guarantee you the CIO of that organization had sent something to CISA at various points over the last 2 years saying that they'd removed or patched Log4j, right? But what most people don't realize is that there are not a lot of automated systems out there that could respond and say, oh, this flaw was detected in this piece of technology, click a button, or automatically go and run around and patch everything or turn stuff off or give people a list to say, here are the things you need to go by hand. Many organizations and most federal agencies are like this, but also pretty much every Fortune 500 public company is like this. They use people instead of technology, and people are highly valuable. You give a systems engineer a list of 137 systems to log into. You have to trust and make sure that he hits all 137 of them. What if he forgets one? What if one is mislabeled? What if he does one twice and forgets about the one that's in a slightly different rack or something? I built one of the largest automated cloud computing environments out there. We had about 45,000 servers, entirely automated management. And if it couldn't automatically update itself, we took the server offline, wiped it completely, and put it back in the queue to just be completely rebuilt. No human touched any one of these servers. Right. That was over 10 years ago. Okay? That technology has existed for a while, but most organizations don't know how to replace what they're currently doing with that kind of full automation. And so we have a lot to do on cyber, and we aren't using the tech we have, and we have to invest in more of it.
The third piece of the future is the idea of competition. We've seen massive consolidation in the banking industry. Yeah. We've seen this balance between the big banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and then the regional banks. Mm-hmm. We don't go to branches anymore.
Not at all.
Which inherently creates. My mom's the only one who says to me, "I got to go to the bank." And I'm like, "I haven't been to a bank. I got USAA. I haven't been to a bank in 20 years." Yeah. Is this good or bad? And how is competition between the big banks, the small banks, helping or hurting?
So I'm a capitalist, and so I always want the market to do what the market is good at, and the market flourishes when there's competition, when there's disruption, where there's innovation, and where the big guys are kept on their toes by the little guys, right? Banking is a great example of that, where we've created a system partially through regulation, partially through kind of different political infrastructures that kind of have everybody playing the exact same thing, just doing the same thing. If you go to a regional bank in the Midwest versus J.P. Morgan versus insert any other bank. I won't use J.P. Morgan as an example, but like just you go from one of these big banks to the little banks, you don't see a lot of difference. Right. Maybe one app is a little better. Maybe you get a slightly different interest rate on one. Maybe you have a slightly different product or service mix. Now, where I see amazing competition right now is in the fintech space, like payments in particular. Like you go out with some friends and it's like, oh, so-and-so, they won't let us split the bill. So, we all, take a picture of it. We figure out what we each owe and John pays. And then we all, use an app and send John money. Right. Huge competition in that space. I think I've got like 6 different apps that do that on my phone.
Venmo, Cash App.
I mean, all of these, right? I mean, huge competition there. But that's not the banking system anymore. It used to be the banking system. Back in the 80s, it'd be, I could write a check or I could hand you cash, and that was kind of it, right? Now it's a whole different thing. And now Apple's getting into it, Google's getting into it, Apple Pay and all this stuff, right? All the smartphone providers are getting into it, the social media apps.
You can send people money on your phone, directly from your phone without even those apps.
Yeah, I mean, if your phone wasn't right there, I could, do a thing on mine and just kind of wave it at your phone and it would send you $5, right? I know you can do it with the watches, which is, interesting too, right? So, the minute the glasses come out, we'll be able to I'll stare at you and send you money or something. That'll be so weird. But that's where the innovation and disruption is happening, right? And then the minute that moves out of even the payments and it moves into, social media or Twitter, Elon Musk wants to make Twitter a payments company. He wants to have you be able to send money back and forth, buy stuff, whatever on Twitter, because he wants his 0.5 percentage point of all of that, because he's got to make up the $50 billion he borrowed to buy Twitter, right? He's going to recreate PayPal as a social inside of that. It's going to be X. He's going to, it's kind of clear what he's going to do there. Well, the regulatory system won't be able to stop him at all. They'll try and it won't happen. But we have this massive struggle where the places competition are happening are not inside of the regulated environment. And that's the problem. You have to create a space in the regulated environment for innovation and disruption to happen in a controllable manner. Because right now it's not possible. There is no ability for us right now to make sure that the little banks are actually competing with the big banks, or the new banks are competing with the old banks. There's no system in the regulated environment that allows for that.
What's the next big tech innovation?
So I'm going to answer this in two ways. Okay, so the first is we are in the midst of making people irrelevant in certain industries. Banking, financial services, we're going to start seeing organizations needing far less people to do more work. So we are actually finally seeing core tenets of our economic system get changed because of the application of automation. So automation is the key word I would use there. And in some cases, it's going to be very much on purpose. And in other cases, it's going to be almost accidental that it gets created. So bank tellers. We probably won't need as many bank tellers in the future.
Right.
But guess what? More money is flowing through the system than it ever has before, right? That's number one. And then number two, the thing I am most interested in is neuroelastic computing. Okay? Neuroelastic computing is the ability for us to create actual artificial intelligences, because right now we really don't have any real artificial intelligence, but an artificial intelligence that mimics the structure of an organic system, like a human or a gnat or whatever, and that you see operational AIs that look like that. So just imagine a fleet of next generation fighters with no pilots. Maybe there's one's got a pilot and the other ones are swarming around him like a bunch of gnats.
Well, we saw this. Sikorsky just launched the Blackhawk.
The new pilotless Blackhawk and the whatever they're calling the next gen Army helicopter UAV program. Yeah. There's plenty of computational power in that infrastructure that would allow us to put that kind of stuff in there. And so you could have drones, you could have helicopters, you have airplanes, you have all these things in highly coordinated ways operating as if they're a single organic system. Wow. That's, to me, an incredibly exciting piece of technology that we're just starting to see. And in terms of military applications, I think it's one of the most interesting.
Yeah. Sultan, as we close out, the Jedburghs had to do 3 things every day to be successful in their world. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, and they had to be able to communicate.
Yeah.
If they did these 3 things with the utmost precision, calm foundations, habits, then they could apply their focus on more challenging tasks that came their way. What are the 3 things that you do every day to set the conditions for success in your world?
This is such a great question, and I've been waiting for you to ask me this one because it's just it's a fantastic thing. It's one of the reasons why this is such an amazing podcast. So thank you for having me on.
Thanks for
coming. Wonderful. So I will tell you the 3 things I do every day. One is I make sure I get really good sleep. That is absolutely critical to me. If I don't get good sleep, I don't get executive function. I don't get my critical thinking skills up. I cancel the day. If I, like a lot of people, I don't sleep very well sometimes. So if I have like a 3-hour night, I cancel most of my meetings. I just, get some walks in, listen to podcasts, all that. So that's number one.
I envy you.
Yeah. It's just, I'm very lucky that I'm at a point where I can do that. Number two is I learn. I absolutely have to learn something every single day, something that has a direct outcome attached to it, right? It isn't just, oh, I learned some interesting historical factoid about Julius Caesar. No, it has to be, I have to learn something that's meaningful relative to what I care about, what I'm working on, that kind of stuff. And the third is I have to do something that makes me tired. I have to physically do something. I have to run. I have to walk. I have to put some furniture together. I have to woodwork. I have to do something that has a tangible, quantifiable output, whether it's calories or, oh, I have a bench now, or whatever it is. If I can do those three things, then the rest of the day will work out.
Get good sleep.
Yeah. Learn
every day, and do something physical that makes you tired.
Yeah.
No, I like all three of those. The first one I love, because that's where I'm always struggling.
I think
we got a newborn now too.
Well, especially post-COVID, where we all are in these hybrid environments. I mean, we're doing this at my house, right? Like This is like we all are dynamically in movement more. We are all occasionally locked in our houses more. I'm not optimistic we won't have another pandemic. I think this is just kind of like version 1, and so I think this is going to be a thing. I think we'll be better at managing the next few, but we are not taking care of ourselves very well. We are not getting the sleep we need. We are not giving ourselves the emotional space we need. To be a good leader now, I think, especially when you look at all the different generations we're navigating around and the different backgrounds and everything, you have to lead with a very high EQ. You have to lead with a degree of kind of understanding that it's almost like you're dealing with a bunch of aliens, because they're going to be so different than you are in so many ways. And going into that, if you're exhausted or you haven't had the time to think or learn or kind of get your body to a certain place, you go in and you have a meeting where there are 11 people around the table who all hate each other, because that's just what our culture is like right now. There is no way for you to be a leader for those 11 people.
Yeah. Cognitive function declines.
Absolutely.
It's true fact.
Yeah. And I know that, my primary, like, there's a certain window of time every day where I know my brain is at 120%. It's not a big window, but I know that there's kind of a 3 or 4 hour window. And once I am outside of that window, I don't try to force it, because I know it won't be very good.
We talk about the 9 characteristics of elite performance used by Special Operations Command in the identification and the recruitment, assessment, and selection of high-performing talent. A lot of our conversations and different podcasts and episodes that we have bring these concepts in: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, emotional strength, and effective intelligence. In order to be a high performer, individuals will exhibit all of these characteristics, never at once, because you're faced with different situations, you require different components. But generally, you have high levels of each one of these. At the end of these conversations, I always think about one that sums up our conversation, defines my guest in my eyes. And for you, I think it's curiosity, because technological innovation requires the challenge of the status quo. It requires you to wake up every day and ask a very simple question: can it be better? Is there another way? And we've had conversations where we've said, your answer to that question always has to be, of course it can be better. I might not know what it is today, but then to your second foundation, learn. Can I find the answer? Can I push myself to go not only ask the question, but seek the solution to confirm or deny my hypothesis that it can be better? And that takes an incredible amount of curiosity. But it's curiosity that drives innovation in whatever your organization seeks to do. And you've done that across so many different organizations. You continue to set the example and the standard for all of us who seek to latch on to technological innovation. Even if some of us struggle to figure out how to shut the ringer off on our iPhone, there's a lot more out there. It's changing the world. You're leading it. Thanks for inviting me here today. Thanks for this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have spent some time with you today, and to be added to a really amazing list of guests. And I hope people who maybe came to this podcast because they wanted to hear me speak will come back and listen to all the other podcasts, because you do such a great job with so many people with so many interesting backgrounds. So I really hope a lot of people listen to the podcast. It's great.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot.
All right.
American Jedburghs went out to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor Jersey Mike Subs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As a former member of Special Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast donates a percentage of all proceeds to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.